Okay, so welcome back. This is the last part of the Industrial Revolution, and it's about ways of thinking, or new ways of thinking, rather. So we actually start off with an old way of thinking, which is laissez-faire. So as we've already learned about laissez-faire in either economics or in earlier units in world history, Adam Smith and others, they assert that a free market or an unregulated exchange of goods and services would help everybody in society, and it wouldn't just benefit the wealthy. It benefits everyone, not evenly, but it does benefit everyone. So Smith argues that the free market is going to produce more goods, and because there's more of them, they're going to be sold at lower prices, making those things available and increasing people's standard of living. So on top of this, a growing economy would also be one that would see the capitalists who are making profits taking those profits and then investing them into further business ventures. So they're not just sitting on the profits; they're doing something with them. And these new business ventures create more opportunities for jobs, meaning more work. More work means more things to buy. More things to buy means an increase in the standard of living. So if you were to actually look at individual nations that were industrializing during this period, so Great Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and the United States, this is actually accurate. Thomas Malthus, he has a population theory that he comes to during this time, and he, like Adam Smith, is a laissez-faire economist, and he is looking at the increased rate of population that the Industrial Revolution brought on, and so you've got cities, right? Cities used to be a couple hundred people, a couple of thousand people. Now it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. London's over 1 million people. And he sees this as being unsustainable because he doesn't believe that the production and supply of food is going to be equal to the number of mouths to feed. Now, he posits that there's going to be these natural checks that are going to come about. So we're going to have war, disease, and famine, which will, you know, right the ship. And poverty, according to Malthus, is an outgrowth between the ability to produce food and the tendency to reproduce. So in essence, poor people, they have too many mouths to feed, and that's why they're poor. So if they would just have fewer children, and that's what he espouses, um, they they would live better lives. He also takes the approach that charitable handouts, like from churches and things like that, that those are not actually helping the problem, that they're actually worsening the problem, and that if the church would stop taking in like orphans and things like that, then those infants would die, and that would solve the problem. It's a pretty bleak view, I gotta say. He's also against vaccinations, and the reason why is because vaccinations, they counter disease, and that means that more people are going to live, and Malthus sees this as a problem. So Malthus is wrong, and we need to look at like why is he wrong? He's not wrong in the one sense, which is population does exponentially grow compared to what it was prior to the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it looks like a J. It just, you know, before World War One, there were about 1 billion people. Today, we have over 7 billion. Well, what Malthus thought: war, disease, and famine. That has not come to pass. So why? Well, first is family planning is going to be introduced. It takes a while, but it does happen. And I'm not just talking about like condoms and birth control. I'm also talking about the fact that like because more children are living, you don't have to have 5, 7, 9, 10 kids. You can have 2, 3 children, and if they're all going to reach, or many of them are anyways, are going to reach adulthood, you don't need to have as many kids. And that ties in with the second point, which is that there's fewer child mortality. This is in part because of vaccinations, plus people are able to actually feed their children and then keep them in like warm homes and things like this. So fewer kids are going to die. And then politically, economically, and culturally, decisions are made that actually limit population growth. Okay, so the other thing is the food supply actually grows at a much faster rate than was projected. And the reason for this is there's new technologies that actually increase the efficiency of farming. So even though you have fewer people farming, you're able to get better yields. One of the things is mechanization, and this is in no small part because of Watt's steam engine. The first tractors will be steam powered, things like that. And then the increased understanding of chemicals are going to be able to produce chemical fertilizers, but also chemical pesticides, and this is a huge deal. And then irrigation. Irrigation is going to be able to counter one of the biggest problems of the time, which was drought. And then there's new methods of food preservation and distribution. So you've got canals, railroads, and steamships, which are able to move food from where it's being grown to wherever it's needed. And this is a big deal. And then you have pasteurization from Louis Pasteur, which is going to solve a spoilage problem. Then you're going to have preservation. People have been salting food for a while, but they're going to be able to figure out how to put food into like tin cans, and they're shelf stable, and they can be moved. And then eventually we'll get to refrigeration too. The next economist we have is David Ricardo, and he's also a laissez-faire economist, and he wrote a book called The Iron Law of Wages, and he argues that the working class are essentially unable to escape the poverty that they're in, and it's because of the fact that they don't make enough money, and it's because they're not paid enough. And his work and others like him, they lead to economics being called the dismal science. So Ricardo's book, it points out that wage increases are futile, because if you give somebody a raise, right, it's only ever going to cover the cost of necessities that they need, like food and shelter. And there's a little bit more to it than this too, which is that, if you increase somebody's wages and they begin to live slightly more comfortable lives, that could be a signal for them to have another child. And if they do that, that means they have another mouth to feed, and then that means that this increase in wage will no longer suffice, and then they'll just slip back into poverty. So that's his view. So the results of the dismal science on policy are governments like that of Great Britain, they're influenced by these works of Malthus, Smith, Ricardo. And so there's this view that comes out of this, which is that any attempt by the government to actually alleviate the plight of the poor is not a good thing. And so it meets with all kinds of opposition in Parliament, places like that. And the belief is that you have to have this strict laissez-faire, or like hands off the market, and that will sort out the problem of poverty. And individuals could improve their position in life if they worked hard, they saved. That's what thrift is, and they just limited the size of their families. And this is a counter. I mean, the limiting the size of your families, anyways, is a direct contradiction to the teachings of some Christian faiths. Like Christ said, "Go forth and multiply." So in Catholicism and other religions or sects of Christianity, like, they don't practice that. I mean, it's like a gift from God if you have 12 kids. Okay, so this is an issue. So we have the utilitarians next. So Jeremy Bentham is a utilitarian. He's a philosopher, and he formulates the theory of utilitarianism, which argues that an action is right if it creates happiness in the greatest number of people, and it's wrong if it produces the opposite effect. And he also is a political radical, and he advocated for like separation of church from state, which in England is not what's done back then, because the church is actually, even to this day actually, it's established and run by the state. Freedom of expression. He believes in equal rights for women, the right to divorce, and the decriminalization of homosexual acts. I mean, he's way more than a century in advance of what other people are. He's definitely a radical. He also called for the abolition of slavery, getting rid of capital punishment, so don't hang people or cut off their heads. And he actually supports an early form of animal rights. And I wanted to include this because I think this is very interesting. So on his death in 1832, he left instructions for his body to be first dissected, and then to be permanently preserved in what's called an autoicon, or it's a self-image, which would be his memorial. So at one point they had his body on display at University College in London in the Student Union. And so this is an example. This is his actual mummified body. So that's his head. Another person that came out of this with utilitarianism is John Stuart Mill. John's father had been a student of Jeremy Bentham, and he shared his view of individual freedom. And he argued that the government of Great Britain needed to step in and improve the lives of the working class. So this is in direct contradiction to people like Malthus. So he's not a laissez-faire person. Utilitarianism is not like that at all. It's the opposite. He also argued for the expansion of the right to vote to the working class, and then also to women. this will eventually happen first to the working class men, then eventually women. And I mean, when this happens, and it doesn't happen right away, but when it does happen, it does have an influence on Parliament, and reforms will get pushed through. Um, so today, utilitarianism is part of democratic governments throughout. Like, whenever something is passed, part of the debate, anyways, is like, well, how is this going to impact people? And if it impacts more people in a positive way than a negative way, then it's usually adopted, and vice versa. And then in reaction to this, we also have socialism. So first thing is we got to look at what is socialism. So it's different than capitalism. And under a socialist economy, the means of production, and that's pretty much everything. It's farms, factories, railways, large businesses, the tools, all that stuff. These are going to be owned by society rather than individuals. And connections between socialism and the Enlightenment are over concerns for like things like social justice, progress, and then human nature. So socialism was seen as the answer to the poverty of the time, and then the injustice to the working class that suffered under industrial capitalism. In socialists, they believe that private ownership of the means of production would always lead to wealth for a concentrated few, the people at the top of the pyramid, the rich, and then injustice for the poor, which is the bulk of the bottom. One of the things that comes out of this is this out of socialism is this concept of utopia, and so there were many socialist communities established in Europe and North America in which all work was shared and all property was held in common. Right. One example is Robert Owen, a utopian. He created this model community in New Lanark, Scotland, and he put into practice his views, which included like free housing for the people that work there, and education for those people so they learn how to read and write, and then no child labor. This is like way ahead of its time. And he leaves New Lanark and he purchases the Indiana commune of New Harmony, which contained 180 buildings, which had housing for 800 people. It had 4 working mills, a textile factory, 2 churches, and a brewery. And New Harmony is one of 7 Owenite communities founded in 1825 and 1826. And you can go and Google utopian communities, and there are some established here in Michigan. They're all over the place. The belief that these people have is that there should be no class distinction. This is like a generality, but like this is one of the common threads of utopia. So class distinctions, they believe, like some people are rich, some people are poor. If you could get rid of that, then what you would be getting rid of is the reason for these classes to have conflict, and that people would just get along. And so these people are called utopians, and it's based on an earlier work, much earlier work, which we've talked about in the past when we talked about the English Civil War. I'm not going to get into that again, though. But the name also implies that these people are impractical dreamers, because it's a little bit more complex than just saying that if you rid people of their wealth or their conception of poverty, that they're just suddenly going to get along. And that leads us to the big guy, Karl Marx. So he was born on May 5th in 1818 in Trier, Prussia, which at the time was part of what's called the German Confederation. When he goes and he studies, first at the University of Bonn and later at the University of Berlin, he studies law. His father wants him to be a lawyer like he is, and he studies philosophy as well. Marx is an interesting guy. He grows up in a fairly, I wouldn't say it's too privileged, but he grows up in a middle class life. And so when he's in college, he does what lots of college people do. He drinks and parties a lot. So much so that his father is worried about him and pulls him out of the University of Bonn and sends him to Berlin, hoping that he'll straighten up. Well, one of the things that Marx becomes involved in is a group of really radical leftist thinkers known as the Young Hegelians. And the Hegelians are based off of a guy named Hegel, and he critiques like established society, meaning society as it is, politics and religion, and Marx really buys into this. And so much so, actually, that at one point Marx actually gets into an argument with a Prussian member of the aristocracy, and they get into a fight, and Marx is like slashed across the upper eye by the Prussian noble's sword. So it's an interesting time to be alive, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. So because Marx is a known member of the Young Hegelians, it means that his goal, which was to become an academic, like a professor, it ends because in Prussia, those people are barred from holding those positions. So Marx is going to leave Berlin and he'll go to Cologne, which is in Western Germany. Again, Germany doesn't exist yet, not like we think of it, but and while he's there, he becomes a journalist and he works at this newspaper. It's a radical leftist newspaper called the Rhineland News, and the Prussian government is going to end up shutting it down in 1843. So through censorship and that sort of thing, come in, break up the paper by pulling out the press and destroying it. So Marx, right off the bat, he begins his life in opposition to what's created. Now the reason why is because of the French Revolution. So, as we talked about, Napoleon exports the French Revolution. He moves out of France and he moves east, right? One of the places that the French Revolution is brought to is the old Holy Roman Empire. And remember, I told you guys that the Holy Roman Empire meets its end under Napoleon, and the HRE is instead reestablished as the German Confederation. So, Karl Marx's father, Heinrich, he was a lawyer and he was able to practice his profession under the Napoleonic era. And the reason why is one of the things Napoleon did was he got rid of all of the old anti-Jewish laws. Well, in 1815, Napoleon is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, and so things begin to go back to the way that they were. So Prussia goes back and they establish that Heinrich Levy, that's his last name, Levy, is unable to practice his law because he's a Jew. And so his members of his profession, they like lobby the Prussian government saying like, Heinrich should be able to practice law, and he's not able to. They say no. So what Heinrich does is he changes the family last name from Levy to Marx, and then he converts from Judaism to Lutheranism. Now, Karl Marx's grandfather was a rabbi in Trier. So the family has really taken a radical turn. So from 1843 to 1845, Marx is going to he's going to co-edit a new radical leftist newspaper that's out of Paris, and it's called the German-French Annals. And what it does is it brings together German and French socialist radicals. And the paper is, again, going to be banned because Prussia sees it as being against its established order of the aristocracy, the bourgeois, and then the bourgeoisie, and then the working class. And because it's banned in Prussia, it subsequently will collapse for financial reasons. So in 1844, Marx is going to meet somebody who's going to really change history and change Marx's life, and that is fellow German socialist Friedrich Engels, and a lifelong friendship will form out of this. Engels is an interesting guy. I mean, he's German just like Marx. He would readily admit that between the two of them, Marx was like the more intelligent. But that doesn't mean that Engels isn't intelligent. He is. But Engels' father owns a factory in Manchester, England, and so Engels is going to support Marx throughout his life. I mean, like pay off his debts, pay for his rent, pay for food, all these things. So like the guy who establishes like what communism is going to become is actually these things are paid for off of the labor of the working class up in Manchester in England. So it's interesting. But what Engels does to Marx or for Marx is he convinces Marx that the working class would be the agent of change in the final revolution in history towards a post-capitalist society, which is what socialists believe. So Marx is now living in Paris, and he begins to really seriously study like political economy, capital, and capitalism, and he develops what he terms his scientific socialism. And Marx, being the radical that he is, he gets himself into trouble in Paris. Plus, he's being watched by the Prussians, who have their own spies inside of Paris, and they report to the Parisian government. And the Parisian government is heading like to Marx's apartment to arrest him, and so Marx has got to flee, and he flees to Brussels, which is where lots of radicals flee because it's like a politically neutral place. So that's where Marx ends up. So he used to be in Germany, and then he has to flee to Paris, and now he has to flee to Brussels. So while in Brussels, Marx makes a breakthrough, and that is his historical materialism. And what it is it's an argument that the world is not changed by ideas, and instead it's changed actually physically through material activity, through people working. Okay, and Marx is going to continue to write and refine his thoughts, um, but he's constrained, and why he's constrained is that he cannot write about contemporary politics, and this is part of the agreement that the Belgian government has, which is that look, if you want to be here, you can't stir up trouble. So Marx is going to make a break from other utopian socialists of the period because they felt that you could just win over individuals to the socialist movement. So it was like a secret society. It was like you would just go to people like one on one, and you would bring them over to your socialist viewpoint. And Marx's view, though, is that you can take the entire working class and you can mobilize them in mass. This is what Engels had told him earlier, right? And you can create a revolution and then thus precipitate societal change. So this is radically different than what the utopians were trying to do. So Marx and Engels working together, they wrote what's called the Communist Manifesto. I encourage you to read it. It's very small. It's not going to like radicalize your mind or anything like that. But what it is it's a program of action for this new entity, which is called the Communist League. And the Communist League is in place, is going to supplant the Socialist League, which had, or Utopian League, which had been before it. And the Communist Manifesto begins with these words. It says, quote, "The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles." And so class struggle becomes the thing that Marx is going to be most well known for. And what the Communist Manifesto is it says it's a program of action, right? It briefly describes what the problem is, what the solution is, and where it's headed. And Marx and many socialists, they believe that capitalism was just part of, it was a stepping stone in the direction of something that would be post-capitalist. And for Marx, that's this communist dream of like no more class structure, uh, people aren't exploited. He has a whole number of things, but there are problems with the Communist Manifesto, but it's definitely worth reading. So I want to give you guys some historical context for what's going on at the time. So preceding the Communist League were socialists and liberal political parties and groups. And Marx and Engels, through their work with the manifesto, they set the Communist League apart from those earlier socialist movements because it's now going to be based on class. So the manifesto, the communists are going to be specifically targeting the working class, and it's open. It's not in secret. It's not a secret society like the Utopian League had been, and it doesn't focus on individuals. It focuses on the entire class of the working class. And this just happens to come out at a time. I'm talking about the Communist Manifesto here. It comes out a year before radical protests, rebellions, and violent upheavals happen all throughout Europe. And this is collectively known as the revolutions of 1848. Now, with the exception of France, which France is a monarchy, right? It gets overthrown, not in the same sense as like the French Revolution. And what is established is what's called the Second French Republic. Okay, Marx himself, his father has died, and he will come into an inheritance, and he will spend a portion of it, maybe up to a third of it, to help back the Belgian workers. Remember, he's in Brussels, right? To revolt against the Belgian government. Well, because of this, he ends up he gets arrested and then is forced to leave Belgium, and he goes to France because France has a new government now. It's the Second Republic. It's not a monarchy anymore. And eventually, though, Marx will actually return to Germany, to the German Confederation. He'll return to Cologne, and he will again get himself into trouble here, though, because what he tries to do is he tries to provoke the bourgeoisie there to overthrow the aristocracy, which was in control of Prussia and the German Confederation, so that then the working class could overthrow the bourgeoisie. Because for Marx, it's a process. The working class can't just overthrow the aristocracy. It has to be the bourgeoisie overthrows the aristocracy, and then they establish capitalism as it was known, say in like Great Britain, and then the working class, being exploited by the bourgeoisie, could then rise up in a revolution, and then bring about the end of capitalism, and then the movement towards socialism, and then post-socialism is communism. So Marx ends up, he's stateless, meaning nobody will accept him. So he ends up moving. What I mean by that is like he can't move back to France, he can't go back to Belgium, and he can't stay in Germany. So what he does is he moves to England. He lives in London, and this is where he'll be for the rest of his life. So the Communist League is now a thing, and Marx is integral to it. And so when Marx leaves Brussels, which is where it was founded, to Paris, it follows him there. And then when he goes from Paris to Cologne, it follows him there. And then now he's in London, so it goes there. It's going to end up dividing, though. The Communist League will divide. And the issue is, what they're debating is, should there be a revolution now? Well, Marx looks at what happened in 48, and he sees that it's not time. The revolutions, they all failed, and the reason why was because they were put down by the aristocracy, like in Prussia, places like that. So Marx interestingly says the following thing. He says that he's opposed to any plan of uprising, and he warns that society cannot be changed through the efforts and the willpower of a handful of men, which is interesting because the Bolsheviks go against this in the Russian Revolution, which we'll get to at some point. So it's interesting. Marx would not have anticipated that his ideals would have come about in Russia. Like that would have been the last place, actually. So in 1857, something happens, and that is that the United States goes into this economic crisis, and it's known as the Panic of 1857. And this panic, which begins in the United States, will ripple outward. It'll affect Great Britain, France, Prussia, and elsewhere. And it's the first truly global economic crisis. And there was no economic theory or model at the time that would have explained this, that it wouldn't have seen the interconnectedness of the economies this way. And so it creates a crisis. Well, this creates an opportunity, briefly anyways, for Marxists, as the members of the Communist League, they want to see what they can do in America. And there is a hunger, actually, in parts of America anyways, for what's being debated over in Europe. It fizzles out, though. So, and there's a reason for that, and that is actually more political than economic, and we'll get into that in a different day. So while Marx is in London, what he does is he'll spend years in the reading room of the British Museum, and what he is doing is he's studying and reflecting on the works of political economists. So he's reading Smith, he's reading Ricardo, and he's looking at the economic data that's coming in the British Empire. And so what comes of this is what's called Das Kapital, and this is where Marx has studied the labor theory of value, which that's not actually Marx's theory. It's actually Adam Smith's and David Ricardo, who, remember, these are laissez-faire people, and they came up with the labor theory of value. He studies it, and he comes up with this. It's massive. It's a massive comprehensive treatise on the history of economics, economic thought, and it's like two parts. It's Das Kapital and the theories of surplus value. And he's going to continue to work on iterations of this throughout the rest of his life. And so there's actually multiple publications of this. And the work it's very dense. It's definitely approachable. You can read it. I have not read this. But what Marx does in this is he gives his critique of capitalism. So all societies at any point in history, and since you guys have already had economics or in the process of having economics, you know that there are three economic questions that every society has to answer with, which is what do you make, who makes it, and then who gets those goods. So what Marx's study specifically gets to is who gets the surplus of what is made. So and Marx looks at, like, in a slave society, the slaves produce goods, and then the master gets the surplus, right? They get everything. In a feudal society, the serfs produce goods, and then the lords get the excess. We talked about this. We said that the serfs worked on the land, right? And they gave goods over at first, anyways, until money, the economy was adapted, and then in their place, or what the serfs got in return for this production of goods was like safety, right? Well, in a capitalist society, employees, they produce goods, and then the employer gets the excess, the surplus. So what Marx is concerned about is the surplus specifically. So Marx looks at the surplus as being the key issue behind the inequality. So under capitalism, the employee produces the surplus, right? So you produce textiles, or you produce tobacco, or you produce whatever, right? You get better and better, more efficient at it, right? But you're paid a wage, And so even if you produce more of something and create a surplus of it, you don't actually enjoy any of that. Instead, that's taken by the employer as profit. And this creates the inequalities of capitalism. So you have a concentrated group, the bourgeoisie, who are, you know, growing in terms of wealth. And then you have this large number of people, the working class, who are employees, and they're not seeing the benefits of that. So Marx goes on to make some other distinctions. He talks about alienation and how people are not happy because they're alienated from their work. Like they create something and then it's taken from them. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that Marx is making a distinction here between what is value and what is price. Most economics, and since you've had economics, it's all about price. Okay, they look at supply and demand where they intersect, and they'll talk about price. Marx isn't talking about price; he's talking about the value. So for Marx, the value of what is produced is based around the labor that's put into it, and that's really a key thing. So Marx, you know, you're gonna, if you haven't already heard about him, like the thing that you'll hear about him from this point forward is, you know, communism. Well, Marx is about a lot more than just communism. Okay, communism is based on Marxist ideology, but Marx has something to say about socialism and like the economy in general. And so he shouldn't just be disregarded out of hand because of like what happens with the Soviet Union or communist China or Cuba, Vietnam, places like that. He does need to be looked at. He does because he does have something to offer. He does have a point, and you know, keep that in mind. Okay, and that's where we'll end it. Okay, that's the end of the age of industrial revolution. What we'll get to next is the different revolutions that happened in Europe and the Americas, and then we will move on to nationalism. So that's where we're going to be for like the next couple of weeks. Okay, thanks, guys.